Hong Kong is in the doldrums. The last relatively free zone in mainland China is in dire straits. The so-called Special Administrative Region is becoming less and less special and more Chinese, which in a way has a lot to do with the growing shadow war between Washington and Beijing, but we'll get to that later. The thing is, I'm sure many of you will remember these images from 2019. That year, some 2 million Hong Kongers took to the streets to protest against the city government. The protesters were thus opposing the local government's plans to pass an extradition law that would allow voices critical of the Beijing regime to be brought before the courts of the Chinese Communist Party. Clearly, this meant a de facto end to freedom of expression throughout the territory, and even more so if you take into account that Hong Kong was a regular meeting place for Chinese dissidents seeking refuge. In the end, that law was not passed, but shortly thereafter, Beijing got its way by other means.
With new national security legislation, China shows it will never loosen its grip on Hong Kong. 21 years ago, 500,000 Hong Kongers took to the streets to stop Article 23. This month, Beijing finally won.
VisualPolitik community, there, right at that precise moment, the history of Hong Kong changed forever. And don't think we're exaggerating. Since then, things have gone from bad to worse. Recently, Beijing has even forced Hong Kong to pass a law obliging the city's authorities to hand over to Chinese authorities anyone who might be considered a threat, whatever the reason. For Hong Kongers, of course, this has been a radical change. Freedom of speech, trust in local institutions, and legal security have evaporated. And that's not all. In recent years, Beijing has been expanding its influence and control over Hong Kong in many ways. For example, the electoral system has been reformed to guarantee Beijing that no opponent of the regime will be elected as a legislator. Only those considered to be true patriots will be able to enjoy this status. Likewise, schools now have to teach lessons on patriotism and national security. Some new textbooks even deny that Hong Kong was ever a British colony. Do you remember these images? We're looking at the transfer of sovereignty over Hong Kong from the UK to China in 1997. These days, many people simply don't believe this ever existed. Of course, freedom of the press has also been brutally attacked, and pro-democracy newspapers that openly criticised the central government, such as Apple Daily, have had to close. And yes, its editor, Jimmy Lai, has been jailed. Beijing has taken care of even the smallest details. For example, by banning the annual rallies that took place on each anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre. So basically, in the last 10 years, Hong Kong has turned a corner. In terms of civil rights, it's unrecognizable, and that naturally has consequences. To begin with, more and more young people are deciding to leave. We're talking about tens of thousands every year. Some go to Canada, others to the United Kingdom. In total, almost 60% of young people between 15 and 30 years of age dream of packing their bags. And we are, of course, talking about a well-educated segment of society, without whom Hong Kong can hardly have a future. Now, why are we telling you all this, and why are we so sour on the place once called Pearl of the Orient? Basically, because China's repression and Beijing's increasing political control is not only being felt in terms of fewer and fewer freedoms, it's also damaging the economy of this city, which, let's not forget, is the financial center of Asia. A status it still maintains, but where nothing is the same anymore. Hong Kong is no longer as attractive as it used to be. Were it not for the fact that Beijing is trying to compensate for the outflow of international capital and the reduction of investments with a shower of millions, the situation could be catastrophic.
Singapore keeps crown as Asia's top financial center, outranks Hong Kong on all factors of competitiveness. GFCI report.
And we're not only talking about banks and offices. For example, tourism, which accounted for around 5% of GDP in 2018, is still at 65% of the levels it received that year. Last year, the Hang Seng Stock Index, which is normally used as a benchmark for measuring the health of the Hong Kong economy, fell 15%, while its American counterpart, the S&P 500, rose almost 25%. And if we look at the bigger picture, the situation is even worse. From the highs at the beginning of 2018, it is down 50%. In the same period of time, the S&P 500 has rallied more than 100%. It's a colossal disaster. And VisualPolitik community, the list only gets longer. Wherever we look, almost everyone points at exactly the same place as the source of all these problems. China. Now, does China really want to condemn Hong Kong to massive failure? How does the security law really affect the economy? Do tensions between China and the US have anything to do with this whole story? Well, let's take a look.
In the absence of repression, more repression.
Just a few weeks ago, we woke up to this news.
Hong Kong, 47, trial. 14 activists found guilty of conspiracy to commit subversion. Western governments condemn verdict in biggest case since introduction of national security law.
After more than 10 months of trial and more than 1,000 days of arrest, 14 of the 16 protesters on trial for fueling anti-Beijing protests were sentenced to jail. According to the Hong Kong courts, the protesters had conspired to commit subversive acts. Well, it turns out that some of those convicted were pro-democracy politicians and legislators from the city itself. And you're probably thinking, what is so unusual about this in a country like China? Well, you see, basically prior to 2019, these defendants could not have gone to jail. But what's more, to make matters worse, the real motive, not the one claimed by the authorities, of course, is that these people were organizing to try to get a majority in the city's legislative council. That was a nuisance for Beijing that they wanted to get out of the way, with fabricated accusations and with the complicity of the judges chosen by the city government. This, of course, undermines the legendary independence of the Hong Kongese courts. After all, the judges themselves may be victims of national security laws. This is the level to which repression has reached in Hong Kong. While if this total lack of legal certainty, both for individuals and companies, already poses problems, let's see what happens if we take a look at other things also imposed by Beijing in recent years. For example, the new understanding of the crime of espionage and theft of state secrets. It sounds reasonable that any country would punish such behavior, but with China, the name given to things and what they really are often have nothing to do with each other. Take a look. You see, a person or a company would be committing a crime if they were sharing information that appeared to be confidential. Let me repeat. Appeared to be. This information no longer needs to be a state secret. It's enough for the authorities to say that it is sensitive and endangers Hong Kong for whatever reason. And take note, because if this is already terrible for ordinary people, let's emphasize something once again. For companies, it can also be awful, and therefore for the economy in general and the future of the city. Just think about it for a moment. Imagine you were a Western businessman in Hong Kong. You had never had any kind of problem. After all, this city was the only truly free and capitalist space in the entire Chinese territory. And wham! Suddenly, these laws are passed, and your lawyers warn you. We are going to have to be very careful with the information we share with you. The Hong Kong government may come after us. So the question is, what would you do? Some of you would maybe stay and be more careful from that point on to stay out of trouble. That, of course, would be reasonable, but in the end, you would still be taking a big risk. However, I'm sure, absolutely sure, that many others would opt for the most sensible option. Get the hell out of there as fast as possible. Well, this is precisely what has been happening in the city for some years now.
The corporate retreat from Hong Kong is accelerating. The commercial hub's ties to mainland China, which global companies once considered an asset, have become a liability.
Do you remember the news we told you earlier about Singapore? Well, these things explain much of the rise of the city-state at the expense of Hong Kong. To give you an idea, the number of regional offices of foreign companies in the city has already fallen by more than 5% since 2019. This may not seem like much, but it means that 1 in 20 have already closed. Major international law firms such as Winston & Strawn, Baker Botts, and Addleshaw Goddard, among others, have already closed their doors in Hong Kong.
Addleshaw Goddard to close its Hong Kong office, banking on Singapore. Winston & Strawn to shutter Hong Kong office. Several international firms have quit Hong Kong in recent years against the background of a dramatic shift in the political climate following Beijing's decision to suppress the Special Administrative Region's pro-democracy movement armed with a controversial new national security law, which was introduced in 2020.
And naturally, given such a situation, any government would be on high alert, trying to change things to avoid the present and future bloodletting. Nevertheless, do you know what the Hong Kong government, which, let's not forget, is subordinate to Beijing, is doing? Well, it's basically beating its chest and congratulating itself. Yes, exactly what I said. Paul Chan, the city's chief financial officer, recently congratulated himself on the fact that 45 companies will be opening or expanding their businesses in the city in the near future. However, he forgot one small detail. 35 of those 45 companies are precisely Chinese. Remember when we told you that China is trying to pour money into the city to counteract the drain of foreign capital? Well, just that. So between one thing and another, Hong Kong is becoming more and more Chinese. This, along with the large companies that the city still has, will probably keep its economy from collapsing, but it will become less and less international. However, in the short term, as many of you already know, China is not exactly going through the best of times, economically speaking, of course. And for many analysts, the future may not be too rosy either. Xi Jinping's government has also been a steamroller for what little business freedom and legal certainty may exist in mainland China, and the Chinese economy has had the brakes on for a few years now, as it faces such serious challenges and demographic aging and a growing labor shortage. Not surprisingly, with these ingredients, the question we should all be asking ourselves is, what will happen to Hong Kong when and if China runs out of cash? Well, if that were to happen, that's where the problems would really start. And pay attention, because we're not talking about a scenario that's not exactly far-fetched either. You see, believe it or not, one of the key issues may lie precisely in the bursting of the Chinese real estate bubble. After decades of state investment in the country's economy, China has managed to forge one of the most formidable real estate sectors in the world. Such is the case that in recent years, it has come to account for almost 30% of the country's GDP between activities and indirect investments. In other words, 1 out of every $3 produced by China is linked to the real estate market. However, for years, the growth of large real estate companies such as the infamous Evergrande was fueled primarily by debt. Yet, with the collapse of Evergrande drowning in debt, confidence in the country's real estate sector has been in tatters. The sector has all but frozen, and between 50 and 100 million apartments have been left vacant in ghost towns across the country. But we've actually already talked about this at length on VisualPolitik. Now, what on earth does this have to do with Hong Kong? Well, you see, as Hong Kong is becoming more and more dependent on a China that seems to have more and more problems, the result seems to be a foregone conclusion. I'm sure you have an idea, but just in case you don't, let's take it step by step. To begin with, in the face of the tidal wave heading towards the Asian giant's economy, Chinese consumers have gone back to doing what they do best: saving, shielding their savings accounts, and reducing their spending. In fact, according to some studies, 60% of Chinese households have decided to take the conservative path in their finances, and this hasn't been good for Hong Kong's economy. And the fact is that, accounting for more than 80% of all visitors to the city, Chinese consumers now spend much less at local businesses. But the Hong Kong economy has not only been hurt by lower Chinese consumption, the real estate crisis has caused the distrust of international investors to spread to everything associated with China. And as we've told you in this video, Hong Kong seems more and more like China. Of course, the point is that Hong Kong is the main financial bridge between China and the rest of the world. For example, in 2021, the city was the source of 76% of all foreign direct investment going into Greater China. But with the international investors pulling the brakes, that has also sunk investment flows through this city, which is bad for banks, consultants, lawyers, and a host of other professionals. All this explains why Hong Kong's stock market has done so poorly and why the city's economy is struggling. But hold on a minute, because there's another reason why the popularity of this city, also as an international financial center, could be running out. Pay very, very close attention.
A pawn on the board.
Surely, when you hear about the Cold War, many of you have in mind the typical: the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the arms race between Uncle Sam and Moscow, or, I don't know, maybe the hunt for Red October. However, there is another scenario that often goes unnoticed: Hong Kong. Especially when we talk about this new kind of modern Cold War that is being forged between the United States and China. You see, the thing is, when in 2019, China began its final assaults to take control of this hitherto autonomous city, the United States responded.
Trump signs Hong Kong democracy legislation angering China. The measure, which could lead to sanctions on Chinese officials for cracking down on the protesters, drew bipartisan support from Congress.
Trump passed, with the support of Republicans and Democrats, two pieces of legislation that would prove to be key: the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act and the Hong Kong Home Rule Act. Well, these laws have two objectives. On the one hand, to punish the officials responsible for human rights violations that occur in the city, and also to punish the banks that handle transactions of those officials. On the other hand, and even more importantly, to withdraw Hong Kong's special economic treatment with the United States. Something that Trump implemented, by the way, but that Biden has also extended.
U.S. President Joe Biden on Wednesday announced his decision to extend a national emergency declared by former President Trump that ends Hong Kong's special status with the country.
And this is where Hong Kong began to feel the effects of geopolitical tensions between China and Uncle Sam. With the end of the special trade treatment, the United States began to apply the same tariffs on products from this city that it applied to China. And keep in mind, these are not exactly trivial amounts. The United States has been increasing tariffs on Chinese goods from 10 to 25% on many products. And in the middle of all this storm was the hometown of Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan. This is what partly explains why the city is no longer so attractive to international capital, particularly Western capital. But that is not their only effect. These measures by Uncle Sam are serving to feed the nationalist discourse that Beijing is trying to implant in the city, using everything from schools to the media. In the end, as we always tell you, there is nothing that has reinforced Xi Jinping's turn to nationalism more than having something to justify it with, and being attacked by foreign sanctions is a good way to do it. The fact is that, as far as the future is concerned, the options for Hong Kong are on a knife's edge, although there are analysts who have some flashes of hope. Although it's understood that we're talking strictly about the economic field and that nothing will ever be the same again. If the city continues to have relatively clean institutions on a day-to-day basis, house in order, then it will retain much of its attractiveness to remain a leading financial center. And not only that, as Hong Kong becomes more and more Chinese, it also means greater economic integration with a colossus of 1.4 billion people. Many companies are now making inroads into the Asian giant. To be honest, however, the case is that others do not see it so clearly. Increased repression will end Hong Kong's advantages over other cities in China, such as Shenzhen or Shanghai, and that will eventually turn it into just another city. Well, this is what is becoming known as the curse of Hong Kong. Be that as it may, the question is now over to you. Do you think Hong Kong's new security law will be the final straw for the city? Will Hong Kong remain one of the world's major financial centers? Or on the contrary, will foreign capital leave for other places such as Singapore? And will Chinese capital stay in the traditional ones, in Shanghai or Shenzhen? Well, we open the debate here below in the comments. But now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any news. As always, thank you so very much for watching. All the best. See you next time.